Hey guys, it's Tori, and today I'm going to be starting off my vlog that I hinted at in my March TBR. I am going to be reading 3 books that were gifted to me by booktubers. A couple of these books I received 2 Christmases ago, and then one of them was just this past Christmas. And I just am such a slacker. I just need to make sure I read these because I am so grateful to the people who provided them for me, and I want to show that appreciation by actually reading the dang things. So, the first one I have already started, and that is How to Be a Victorian by Ruth Goodman. This was gifted to me by Jackie from Jackie Reads and Writes this past Christmas, and it is a nonfiction describing the daily lives of people living in the Victorian era. I am currently in the section discussing getting dressed, and specifically women's clothing, and I'm really enjoying it so far. There's been a lot of things I've ended up sharing with my family because I just found it so interesting, and yeah, I'm really liking it. I'm reading about 17 pages a day throughout the month, and that will give me a few days where I don't necessarily have to read it. So anyway, yeah, I will be reading this, and yeah, like I said, so far so good. Another book that I read just the first page of last night, I actually finished, and I just finished my vlog for Royal Assassin, and so I finished that, and it was pretty late, so I didn't want to start anything else really, but the prologue thing in this was just a page, so I did start that, and it's Daughters of Sparta by Claire Heywood. This one was gifted to me by Connor Stompanato a couple of Christmases ago, and I am really excited to finally get to it. This is a retelling of the stories of both Helen of Troy and her sister Clytemnestra, and I'm very curious to see how I feel about this because I really don't like Helen of Troy and her story. I've never liked any version of the story that I've seen. I think there is potential for a version to be created that I do enjoy, but most of them go for she doesn't really love her husband to begin with, and then she meets Paris and he's so hot, and Aphrodite forces her to fall in love with him, and they run away together, and it causes this huge war, and I just don't, I just feel like it makes her so selfish, and I just can't stand reading about characters like that. But like I said, I think there's ways that this story could be told and explored that I would like better, personally, for my tastes. Whereas Clytemnestra, I actually really do find her story fascinating and appreciate learning about her. I don't necessarily like her, but I feel like her story is more nuanced and complex the ways I've seen it explored, whereas with Helen of Troy, I have yet to see a more nuanced version of it. So anyway, I'm curious to see how I feel about this because there is one character that I'm very interested in and one that I have yet to be super interested in. I also recently received my pre-order for her newest book, The Shadow of Perseus, which was one of my most anticipated releases that I had pre-ordered, and so I really would like to read this one to see and if I really like her writing style and approach to Greek myth, and then I can go into that other one having a little bit better idea of what potentially I could feel towards it. So anyway, yes, I have started this, just the first page, the prologue, but I have technically started it, and it will be the first one I'll probably complete in this vlog. And the third and final book that I'll be focusing on in this vlog is Cecily by Annie Garthwaite. This one was gifted to me by Jennifer Brooks, again a couple of Christmases ago, and it follows the historical figure Cecily Neville, who is the mother of both Richard III and Edward IV, and I've heard really good things about it. I also received a lot of comments in my last TBR when I mentioned I was going to read this from people who also were interested in reading it and therefore interested in my thoughts. So definitely one I'm excited and intrigued to see how I end up feeling about, and would I recommend it to those people who asked or not. This will be the second book that I'll probably read in this vlog, with How to Be a Victorian being the final one that I'll finish, even though I'm the deepest into it because I'm reading it throughout the month as opposed to just reading it straight through like the other two. Some other books that may come up in this vlog, very briefly, I'm not going to focus too much on them because I'm going to focus most on these. I may mention briefly some thoughts on Romantic Outlaws by Charlotte Gordon, which is a nonfiction about Mary Shelley and Mary Wollstonecraft. I'm listening to that one on audio, and I am enjoying it. I'm not very far, but I've enjoyed it so far. That all to say, these will be my main focuses for this vlog, and I hope you enjoy it, and I hope I enjoy these because I'm grateful for those who were willing to provide me with these gifts. It was so kind of them. They didn't have to, but I just really appreciated that, and I want to show that better by actually reading them. So anyway, welcome to the vlog. May it be a great success. So it is March 11th, Saturday, and I have a few updates to give you. If you notice, I'm not wearing my glasses. I did get some trial contacts for now. I'm planning to get more contacts. The only reason I've been wearing glasses in most of my recent videos is actually because I have been too lazy to go get a new prescription for like a couple years now. So my prescription was expired for like at least 2 years, probably almost 3 years at this point. And I finally went and did that. So I am trying some contacts again. After that random tangent, let's talk about the books that I am reading, my thoughts on them. I also recently received another book, so I'll talk a little bit about that. And then I'm going to talk about some of my plans for today because I have exciting bookish style plans today. So let's start, like I said, with what I'm reading. First of all, How to Be a Victorian by Ruth Goodman. I am currently about, 150 pages in. We are still making our way through the morning routine. So we're talking about, getting ready, the clothes they wore throughout the time period, exercise, going to the bathroom, all of those sorts of things. I'm in the midst of the morning exercise chapter, and then it will be breakfast next. So then we'll start moving a little more into the day. And it's really fascinating. There's a lot of things that I've ended up sharing with my family as I've been going along because I have found it very interesting. And it's been just fun thinking about a lot of my favorite Victorian reads and seeing the connections between things that are discussed in those books and things that they really did in that society. Also comparing it to today and seeing where a lot of the things we have today came from is also super interesting. A specific example of me recognizing things from Victorian novels, during this morning exercise portion, they've talked a little bit about gymnastics, and it reminded me, there's a scene in A Laodicean by Thomas Hardy where a man is watching a woman exercise doing gymnastics in her personal gym, which I remember when I read that and I was like, wow, I don't think I've ever read in a Victorian novel them talking about like a gym situation like that. So I thought it was very interesting. And she discusses how for women especially that was more coming into popularity in like the later Victorian period, so like the 1880s, and that's when Hardy would have been writing. So it was just very interesting to see that parallel, just understanding more about the society and then seeing that actively in a novel. Anyway, yes, I'm really enjoying it. Excited to continue throughout the month. It's definitely one that I look forward to reading every day, which is always nice when you're reading just a portion a day of something, to have it be something you are excited to read, and then it just makes it feel more cozy and homey when you're like, oh, I get to read a little bit of this book today, and you just come back to it throughout the month over several weeks. It's just really nice. That's how I felt about Bleak House. There was a lot of coming home feeling, especially in that one in particular, but this one I've had that. I also had that with Crime and Punishment. So anyway, it's really good so far. I also reached exactly the halfway point in Daughters of Sparta yesterday. I was hoping to finish it by the end of this week. It's probably not going to happen, but hopefully I'll still be able to get most of it done. Like hopefully tonight I'll be able to read a good amount. And just, I want to finish this so I can move on to the next one because I have plans actually for what I'd like to do after I finish this vlog. And I'm really excited about them. So I want to get through this, even though I am excited for this. So it's not like I'm like wanting to super rush through it, but I do want to make sure I'm getting through it at a relatively good pace so I can move into my next plan. But anyway, let's talk about my feelings towards this. They've been kind of complex. I have nothing against the writing style. It's not like amazing, but it does the job well. It doesn't distract me. So it's a solid writing style, nothing to scream home about, but it's doing its job. And often it's just nice to have a book where it's just telling you the story, it's getting it out there, and you don't think quite as much about the writing, even though sometimes it's also nice to have a book that's written really well and so you notice certain lines and stuff. Anyway, the characters are where I'm feeling very conflicted. This is very much a feminist story, and I just have issues sometimes with books where it's feminist focused and it's so obvious, like it's like constantly talking about the fact that they're women and everything that goes into being a woman at this time. Don't get me wrong, it's interesting, but I feel like, and granted this book was written, I don't even know when this was published. Oh, apparently it was just in 2021 that it was published. So yeah, anyway, it just feels very obvious and pointed in a way that I don't love. However, I have enjoyed comparing the two sisters, not in a negative necessarily way, just seeing their different outlooks on life and their different personalities and how that's interacting with their different circumstances. I definitely prefer Clytemnestra, which I knew I would. I mentioned at the beginning of this vlog, Helen of Troy is not my favorite legendary figure within Greek mythology. I don't love her story, and I've never really liked how it's been retold. And so far that is the case with her. However, I do sympathize with her and her situation, not giving any spoilers. She's in a situation that she wasn't very actively prepared for, and it's also very sad because she's being expected to sacrifice herself, and nobody's even questioning it. Nobody's even asking her how she feels. They're just expecting her to just deal with it. And so I do sympathize with her plight in that area. Surprisingly, I actually do feel some care for Menelaus, which I'm actually glad of. I was really concerned that both of these men would just be really abusive and unkind, and I just feel like he's definitely not perfect, and he's not very good at helping Helen to feel cared about and noticed, and neither of them do very much to try to build up their relationship until it's too late, which is a shame. But I'm glad that it's not like he's just awful, so obviously she's miserable. It's just kind of like neither of them are putting in the work, and when either of them does put in any work, it's at the wrong time for the other person, and so it's just they're not in sync on whether they're going to make how they're going to make their marriage work and communication. So I can appreciate that different take, as opposed to, like I said, he's super boring or something like that. He kind of is on the boring side of personalities, but I think it's more like he's just very introverted and not very good at talking about things, especially with women, I'd assume. At least so far. Hopefully he doesn't become abusive or something, but we'll see. I'm pretty sure I'm about to meet Paris, so we'll see how that goes, because that's when I get like annoyed with Helen's story. Mostly because to me, I'm like, even if you're in love, and I sympathize with your difficulties, like, you know the oath that all of these men took regarding you and if anybody takes you. And so you are just putting all these people at risk just by doing this for yourself. And I will say that's one thing that's been bothering me about Helen in this book, is she is really selfish and self-centered. Again, I sympathize with some of her struggles for sure. I don't think that she's just making struggles when there aren't any, or that she should just get over it. But I cannot think of a single time that I felt like she was really thinking about someone else for their sake and not just for her own. Clytemnestra, on the other hand, I feel like she does think about herself in association with others and how certain things will impact her, which is only human, but I do feel like we have more situations where she is also really considering the other person's needs and how they're feeling, and Helen just doesn't, which, I mean, from the very beginning of the book, we kind of get hinted that that's their separate personalities. When they're younger, they cause some trouble for a slave, and she ends up being beaten to punish them as girls, and Clytemnestra feels awful about it, and she knows it's a punishment for her, whereas Helen doesn't even notice. And so we right away are learning that about each of them, that Helen just is very self-centered. But I like the nuance that she does have real struggles that you understand, and you don't expect her to just get over it. She just also doesn't have any real care for anybody else, and she expects everybody to love her and do things for her, but she doesn't really give much back. And she's starting to realize that, but I think there's still like this sense of like shame about it, like, oh, I'm so unlovable. Like, I'm pretty sure the last line in the last chapter I read from her was something about her being unlovable Helen. So instead of being like, okay, I need to put in more work, I need to try a little bit harder, she's like, oh, I'm just unlovable, and just is down on herself. And that's shame versus guilt, where guilt can be motivating for change, but shame just keeps you where you are and makes you miserable. And I feel like she's very much in that, which is a bit of a symptom of her being self-centered. Clytemnestra, I feel like her issue, at least as of right now, is she kind of rolls over for her husband a little too much. And I get it, because she's in a situation where it's very dangerous for her, so I respect that she's just trying to survive in some ways, but also trying to make her marriage work. She doesn't want to be miserable, and I appreciate that she's putting forth effort to try to make things work. Obviously, something happens that's unforgivable, and I understand why she will switch eventually in regards to her husband, but it is hard to see her roll over and just kind of accept the abuse. but again, she doesn't really have a lot of options, so I also respect her desire to make it work. And like I said, in contrast with Helen, she is a lot more concerned about her husband's needs as a person and his heart and possible struggles, and she's also concerned about this other woman that part of her does hate, but she also has that care and is willing to sacrifice herself or risk herself for this other woman that she still has a part of her that hates. So I see a little bit more of an awareness of others in Clytemnestra. At this point, I feel like I'm just repeating myself, but it's been a very interesting read because I feel like there's things that are bothering me, particularly about Helen, but I've been able to step back a little bit and really see the nuance in both of their characters, and I've really appreciated that. They feel like fully fledged women, though it does still bother me that I feel like it's very on the nose with the feminism. Like, it's just very like, I'm a woman, lots of talk about being a woman in this society, in these situations and stuff, and all of that conversation, and I just get tired of that after a while. I'm like, you know what, I'm smart enough to figure out that they're women and some of these situations are due to that fact, but also some of them are just life, and I just wish there was a little bit more of just like, these are the characters, this is what they're going through, make your own decisions, have your own thoughts about where these problems are coming from, if it is sexism related, or if it's just life is hard related. So anyway, but overall I am enjoying it. I don't think I like it as much as Elektra because I think Jennifer Saint has a better writing style for what I expect out of Greek myth retellings. However, I have nothing against Claire Heywood's writing style. It's just I prefer Jennifer Saint's style a little bit more. So now that that ramble is over, let's talk about a couple of other things going on. So first of all, the book I received, it was actually hilarious because I did not expect to get this. I had no warning, which if you don't know, I do have my Amazon wish list linked down below, and it's not out of any expectation that people will get me things. It's because I know in the past I have wanted to get gifts for my fellow booktubers and they don't have a link to their wish list in their description boxes, and so I have to ask them directly, which means it's not a surprise anymore, and it's just fun to make it a surprise. So I just put it there so that if anybody's looking for mine, if they happen to, again, I don't expect it, but if they happen to, they can keep it a surprise and have it be extra fun for me. So anyway, I received another book from Connor Stompanato, who originally gave me Daughters of Sparta, and he ended up getting me A Changed Man by Thomas Hardy, which is a collection of short stories by him, and it's actually the only book by Thomas Hardy that was fully originally published as a full book that I did not own. So now I officially have all of his short story collections that were originally made as collections. I have his complete poems and I have all of his novels. So obviously there's a bunch of other short stories that he maybe had in other publications or other collections with other authors, I don't know, but as far as like what I can easily get my hands on with fully published works, I have all of them and it's so exciting. So thank you so much, Connor. I probably won't read this still in this vlog because I did just read Wessex Tales by Thomas Hardy, so that's fresh enough in my mind. I probably will want to wait on this. I did consider reading it for this vlog since it matches what I'm trying to do, but I think I'm gonna wait a bit longer. Maybe I'll try to get to it in Victober. So there's that. The other comment I wanted to make, let you guys know, is I am going to hang out with some friends from college today. I've hung out with them in other vlogs and stuff, so you will have seen them before in different clips if you watch my vlogs. But one of them, who has been attending graduate school at the University of Idaho, is down for spring break, and so we are going to hang out. We're gonna get lunch, we're going shopping, of course going to bookstores. I have made rules for myself to keep myself from hopefully getting anything to add to my TBR. I have a few classics especially that I would like to get other editions of for various reasons, so if I see those, that's what I'll get. And then if there happens to be, we're going to one used bookstore and the other is Barnes & Noble that we're going to. So particularly at the used bookstore, if I find something that's an incredible deal or a book that maybe I know is kind of hard to find, especially where I live, I may be suckered into it, but we'll see. I'm not going to let myself just get anything. Luckily, I think that would usually be a classic, and I'm a little more concerned, I've decided, about my physical TBR for non-classics over here than I am with my TBR for classics, because I just feel like like classics. I'm going to keep reading them, and I'm okay if it takes me a while. I do want to get that down, and I think next year I'll focus a little more on my classics, but I really want to get my non-classics down to a more reasonable amount. So anyway, I will bring you guys along with me. We'll have a little book shopping montage. I'll show you what my haul is at the end, and that's my update for now. I think in my next clip, I was going to talk about it here, but this clip is already long, so I'm going to try to remember in my next clip to make sure to talk about Romantic Outlaws by Charlotte Gordon. I know that's not really the theme of this vlog, but I do want to talk a little bit about it because I'm enjoying it. So I'll try to remember to do that in my next reading update, and I'll probably do that once I have finished Daughters of Sparta. So my next reading update will be finishing this, talking about Romantic Outlaws, and then of course How to Be a Victorian, seeing where I'm at with that. And then my next clip will be a montage and then my haul at the end of that. So that is it for now, and I will see you hopefully soon, because that would mean that I finally finished Daughters of Sparta, which I really want to do. Okay, so our day is over. Hopefully you can't hear my brother and his friends. If you can, I apologize. I just wanted to make sure I got this done. So I was pretty successful. I didn't get everything I was hoping to. I really needed a copy of Jane Eyre that I could annotate, and they did not have any at either of the bookstores I went to. So first we went to Marissa's Books, which is a local used bookstore, and yeah, no Jane Eyre. Well, they did have Jane Eyre there, but it was only in a really pretty edition, and I just really need something that I can feel comfortable annotating. So that was unfortunate. Then we went to Barnes & Noble, and they didn't have any Jane Eyre there either. I was like, are you kidding me? Besides the pretty editions, and I wonder if they're just out. I have to assume they're just out of them. Not that they just don't have it. They had Wuthering Heights, but they didn't have Jane Eyre. So anyway, but I did still get a few things. So I did get one book that I have not read. It's a book that I've never seen in a used bookstore around here, at least, and so I wanted to take the opportunity. It was only $6. Honestly, it's probably one I could have gotten another time, but I decided to get it now, and that's just where we're at. So it's The Miniaturist by Jessie Burton. I read The Muse by Jessie Burton and just thought it was middle of the road. I think I gave it 3 stars. If I didn't, I should have. So not my favorite, but I have heard that this one's better. Most people who have read this one really like it, and those who have read The Muse are kind of similar to me, or maybe they did enjoy it, but yeah, not as good feelings towards that book anyway, so hopefully I will enjoy this one better. All I know about this is I believe it follows a woman who ends up getting married to this merchant, and he creates a miniature version of their home, and I think of them, or maybe it's just the home. Anyway, her real life begins to be reflected in this house in strange ways, and like I said, I've just heard really good things about it. It sounds beautiful. I know there's a film or miniseries maybe adaptation or film adaptation, not sure, but I know there's an adaptation of it, and it's been on my radar for a really long time, so I don't really regret it because it is one that I've wanted for years. Even before BookTube, honestly, I had heard about it, I think from one of my teachers in high school, and found an interest in it. So I'm glad I have it. I'm a little sad that I added to my physical TBR with it, but you know, I'm just gonna keep reading and we'll just see how the rest of this year goes. Moving past my reasons for getting that book, I do have several other books that I have read. Well, one of them I haven't, but it's a special case, and I'll explain that in a moment. At that used bookstore, I found a bunch of Folger Shakespeare classics, which, if you don't know, I am trying to collect these. I have really wanted to. I have my complete works of Shakespeare bind up, but I've really wanted to have an edition of Shakespeare where I collect all of the plays in that edition, and I ended up deciding on this one just for a variety of reasons. So I ended up seeing at the used bookstore what they had, and I mostly was hoping for specifically A Midsummer Night's Dream, which I did find, obviously, which I'm very excited about, and Hamlet, which I ended up finding. I almost didn't because it wasn't on the shelf with the others, and I was like, oh, that's too bad. And then my eyes drifted down the shelves and I noticed it was sitting on top of some other books, so someone had just placed it in the wrong place. Now it's in my hands and I'm so happy about it. I intend to do an episode on both of these books in my podcast that I'm doing, so I really wanted copies of both of them so I could be studying them. We're going to do this one first, Hamlet, so I definitely will need to get through that one fast. That's definitely the chunkiest. It's very interesting to see it in this style, just because, in this format I should say, because it makes it very clear that this is one of his longest plays. And then we'll be doing A Midsummer Night's Dream because we're actually seeing it performed this summer, me and my friend who's doing the podcast with me. So we decided of the ones we're seeing, we wanted to do this one as our episode after Shakespeare Festival. So we're going to be discussing the play both as a play but also based on the version we saw. So it will be a really fun podcast episode. Anyway, I really needed those 2 copies for that reason. So I did get those, but they did have a few others, and most of them I have already read, which is really nice. So they had Much Ado About Nothing, which is my favorite comedy. Romeo and Juliet, of course, a must to get. Julius Caesar, which is also one of my favorites. And then I have one that I have not read yet, actually, but I haven't counted the Shakespeare plays towards my physical TBR numbers anyway, so I'm not going to start now. But I did get As You Like It, so I have that now. And that was my used book haul. And then at Barnes & Noble I did get one book, but it is a book I have already read. I was hoping to get the cloth-bound edition of David Copperfield because I've decided that my favorite Dickens books I'd like to get in the Penguin cloth-bound editions if they have them. However, they unfortunately did not have David Copperfield available in that store, but they did have A Tale of Two Cities, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to get this one because I did give it 4 stars, 4.5 stars. It's definitely not on the level of Bleak House and David Copperfield, but it is something I haven't stopped thinking about. I think of the ones I've read, this is the one where Dickens's writing style stood out the most to me, and so I feel like it has a special place in my heart because of that. Like, I loved this book not necessarily for the characters or for the setting, or I'm sorry, not the setting, the plot. I didn't really love it for the plot necessarily or the characters, although they did play a role. Like, I love Sydney, Carton, there's a few other characters I really like, and some events that take place that really moved me. But it was really the setting of the French Revolution and how that's explored, and then his writing style, writing it, was what I loved and what has really stuck with me. And when I saw what Penguin had as the detail on this cloth-bound classic, I was like, you know what, I need that because it's knitting needles, and the fact that they did it in red is just, if you've read this book, you just know. It's so perfect. I loved it. So I was like, you know what, I'm just gonna get it. Since I wanted to get David Copperfield and wasn't able to, at least I was able to get A Tale of Two Cities. So yes, I got those. Those were that's my haul for this little escapade, and I will update you once I finish Daughters of Sparta, like I said. All right, so it's been longer than I had hoped it would be since I last updated you for me to now update you on finishing this. Let's start with How to Be a Victorian by Ruth Goodman. I am still working my way through this and really, really loving it still. I don't have any complaints. I've gotten to the point where they're getting deeper into the day itself, and they've been discussing a lot about the workplace and a lot of the problems and safety hazards that were going on at the time. They've also discussed a lot about food and what kind of food they ate in each of the various social classes and difficulties with famine and other issues like that, just starvation in general. And it's been really interesting. It definitely has gotten a lot sadder because of all of those aspects, but still very engaging. It's really nice to listen to or read from Ruth Goodman, who has actually practiced a lot of these various methods of living and doing things, and so she's able to give her own insight into a lot of it, which is just really, it really brings it to life. And it's really bringing just the Victorian world to life for me in a way that I haven't experienced before. It will be interesting going into Victorian literature in the future, reflecting on this book. I think it will enable me to understand better what the characters are experiencing on a daily basis, and therefore understand maybe a lot more of their difficulties. So yes, that is great. And like I said, I finished Daughters of Sparta, and surprisingly, I ended up giving this 4.5 on Storygraph and 5 stars on Goodreads. That could change. I tend to, over time, have a better idea of how I feel about a book based on how much it stays with me. But my first instinct last night when I finished was to give it 5 stars on Goodreads, but I would consider it a low 5 stars for sure. I couldn't help but compare this a lot to Elektra by Jennifer Saint, because that is the one other novelization of Clytemnestra's story that I've ever read, and they just really had a very different feel to them. I know in my last clip I mentioned that I was really concerned that this book was going to take a stereotypically feminist approach, meaning that all of the men would be evil and all of the women would be good, but they would be suffering because of the men. And I just really didn't want that. I wanted more nuance to this. However, it did end up surprising me. So let's start with Clytemnestra's story, because I already liked her when I started reading this, or at least I had more sympathy for her than I did for Helen. And the way this book ends, it doesn't end at the end of her story necessarily. It ends partway through the famous story about her that occurs at the end of the Trojan War, but it doesn't go all the way through that story. And I really liked it. I felt like it stopped at a point where you felt like, even though she was in a difficult situation and you knew, if you know her story, you know how it's going to end, there's still a sense of hope with her as far as she is more solidly herself and knows what her values are now and will stand by them in a way that she didn't towards the beginning of the book. And I really loved seeing her grow in confidence and in integrity. Overall, I would say I definitely still prefer her over Helen, because I think she has more of a sense of looking outside of herself. Comparing this to Elektra, I feel like Elektra was a lot more mythological in tone and in the way it told the story, and therefore it was a lot more melodramatic and sad, honestly, whereas this one I feel like had a lot more hope. This was much more realistic. It included aspects of mythology as far as them worshipping gods and all of that, but it doesn't really focus on that as much. Like the people in this, who in the original stories were seen as seers or having some sort of magical capabilities, in this it wasn't necessarily made out to be not true, like it was all fake. It was more like it was all based on faith, like with most religions. Like there was no obvious, like, yes, obviously they're a seer because of this and this. It was more like they had faith in these beliefs and in these ideas of people, but they didn't necessarily have genuine powers in the same way that Elektra, the characters in Elektra, did. And I really liked that, because I feel like in this book it allowed the story to focus in on these characters and their relationships, and allowed us as readers to really get to know them as people as opposed to mythological figures. And it made a lot of the points in the story make more sense as opposed to Elektra. Like the reason why Elektra herself in this book is hateful towards her mother by the end makes a lot more sense, I feel like, than it did in Elektra. Like I feel like there's more reason for her to, as far as in Elektra, she knew the truth about things that had happened, but she still felt the way she felt. I'm trying to keep it as vague as possible if you don't already know the story. But anyway, in this, Elektra is missing information, and so it makes a lot more sense that she would be angry with her mother, because there's information she does not have about why her mother has done what she's done, and I really liked that. And overall, I just really preferred Clytemnestra's story in this over her story in Elektra, but I also feel like they both fit different moods. Like if I want just an exploration of the characters themselves, I would probably reach for this, whereas Elektra I'd reach for if I want a little more of a fantastical, tragic tone to the story, I would turn towards that. And I think the writing style in Elektra is more poetical than it is in this. Moving on to Helen. Helen was where I was really surprised, because I've mentioned I do not have a lot of sympathy for Helen in most of the versions of the story I've heard. Not that I've heard a lot, but usually it's put forward it that she willingly left her husband to go with Paris. I haven't actually experienced a version where they have her not being willing and being taken, and I'd be very curious to read a version like that. So if you know of one, let me know, because I'd be very curious to see how it went. But in this case, she does go willingly. However, there's a lot of sense of she just doesn't know any better. Like, Clytemnestra, I've mentioned, is much more observant of other people, whereas Helen is not. In a lot of ways, that personality trait of hers makes it so she's a lot more naive for a longer period of time. And so there's some naivete behind what she does, but there's also just a lot of loneliness. And while I don't condone her actions, I also understand where she was coming from, and I ended up feeling a lot more sympathy for her once she did leave with Paris and go to Troy, and we're able to see how people treat her and her regrets and her feelings of shame of the decision she's made, and your heart just ends up breaking for her, because 10 years is a long time to feel and experience what she's experiencing, especially when you know that a lot of people are blaming her, but really these men wanted to go to war anyway. They were going to do it with or without her help. She just provided an excuse. So I really appreciated how that came together. As far as the men in the story, there were a lot of men who were just not very good, but there were a few that were good, and I really appreciated the exploration of those people. But there were a few that were good and were beneficial to these women and their stories, and I really appreciated that more nuanced look at this story. Both of these stories really, especially Helen's though, because Menelaus, thank goodness, had a much more nuanced tone to his characterization. Like, he wasn't perfect, and the story wasn't treating him as if he was perfect, but he also wasn't completely evil. And there's this wonderful scene in the end. I'm not going to go into detail, don't worry, but there is a scene in the end where Helen and Menelaus are able to have a conversation, and I just really appreciated that I was like, this is all I've wanted from a story of Helen of Troy. I just wanted to get a little bit more of Menelaus and who he potentially could have been, because I feel like we talk about these women who are in the background of a lot of these stories, and I haven't read the Iliad, so I'm not 100% sure how Menelaus is portrayed, but I feel like when I hear stories of the Trojan War, Menelaus is mentioned as the one who Helen was married to, and that's about it. So, and then he also has a battle with Paris. But those are the only things I have ever heard about Menelaus. So I feel like he, in a lot of ways, is a forgotten hero in the story, and so I appreciate that Claire Heywood gave him a little bit more development and nuance to his character. Sorry, I keep saying the word nuance, but there you go. But anyway, it just went in a direction that I appreciated a lot more, and it made me more appreciative of Helen as a character. That being said, I still prefer Clytemnestra and her story over Helen's, but Helen has risen in my estimation reading this book. If you know of any good Helen of Troy retellings based on what I've said about it, please let me know. The only one I've actually tried that was like a full-length novel was the one by Margaret George, and I DNF'd it because I was super annoyed because it was falling into that she went willingly and her husband's just not good enough and all this stuff, and I don't like it. I really don't like it. So anyway, and I didn't like her character in that book either, how she was described. She was really obnoxious. So anyway, didn't like that one. But if you have any other recommendations about Helen of Troy, let me know and I'll see if I can get my hands on them. So now I am starting Cecily by Annie Garthwaite. I have read the first page, the little prologue part right there. So I've technically started, but that was all I read last night because I really needed to go to bed, so I did not want to stay up much longer than I had to. But I'm really excited about this. I'm excited to get back to the Wars of the Roses. It's been so long, and I'm very curious to explore through the eyes of Cecily Neville. I feel like she will be a very interesting perspective in the Wars of the Roses. So anyway, those are my plans. I'll probably update you when I'm about halfway through Cecily, and then when I finish, so hopefully just 2 more clips unless I end up doing something that I want to share with you. All right, I am officially halfway through Cecily, so I wanted to come on here and share with you my first half thoughts. I am really enjoying this. I actually was thinking beforehand about this clip and how I wanted to verbalize how I'm feeling about it so far, because my emotions are a little, I don't want to say conflicted, they're just hard to describe. I really like the writing style. I think it's pulling me very well into the Wars of the Roses, into the mind of Cecily. It's bringing them to life life in a very nice way. It doesn't feel choppy. It doesn't distract me from anything. It really just feels like it's able to pull me into the story, and I've really enjoyed that. I'm finding through reading this book that I think it's very difficult to approach any part of the Wars of the Roses and do it as well as I would like it to be done in a book this long. In this book, I feel like I'm getting to know Cecily on some level, but she's not a fully rounded person in my mind, because a lot of it is being taken up by telling us what's happening, what political maneuverings are happening, what her husband's doing, the battles he's fighting. And I don't expect it to bring me right into the middle of those situations, because Cecily Neville obviously was not there. She was hearing about it through word of mouth from home. However, I feel like the balance between getting to know Cecily as a character and as a figure with getting through the events that are going on in her life at this point. This is definitely very, slightly pre the Wars of the Roses. I did peek to see where it would end, and it looks like it's going to end before what I would think of as, the second half of the Wars of the Roses goes on. So it seems to end when Edward IV becomes king. I'm assuming the first time. I'm assuming it's not going to go for the whole Earl of Warwick and everything that happened there with Henry VI and stuff, if you know history. I think it's just going to end with Edward IV first time getting on the throne. So it's really a lot of the lead up, and then we're going to get the first part involving her husband especially, and then we're going to get into that, it looks like. So it's covering still a good amount of time. In fact, it's covering 30 years of time. So that's a lot of time, a lot of things going on in that time. So in order to really get through all of that stuff effectively, you have to focus a lot on it. And so the way the author has chosen to do that is Cecily finds out about things from a distance, and it kind of describes her thoughts on them and feelings towards them. It's going through a lot of the births that she's given. It's not necessarily showing the birth experience every time, but it is going through this pregnancy, she lost this child, this pregnancy, this child lived, this was its name. I have not gotten to the birth of Richard III yet. I did, but I'm almost there. I think it's a year before he is born, I believe, is where I'm at. But yes, there's a lot of that. There's a lot of her just having conversations. A lot of it's obviously casual conversation, because she's not going to have serious political meetings or be involved in them because of her position as a woman. So obviously she's not there, but she's having a lot of conversations, especially with her husband. A lot of it is focused around her relationship with her husband and their shared ambitions and some of their different ambitions and slightly different perspectives on the world, and how it kind of feels like Cecily is the first one to really be maybe you should aim for the throne, whereas he's very hesitant with that because his father did betray Henry V and ended up being executed. So he's been followed by this taint his whole life, so he's trying to prove that taint wrong, whereas Cecily is no, we just need to do this because we're not being treated fairly. So we're getting to know her on that level, and within her relationship, and also within her impact on the Wars of the Roses, her interactions with other figures within the Wars of the Roses. So she's met Jaquetta Woodville, who is the mother of Elizabeth Woodville. She's had interactions with Margaret of Anjou, the queen, several other big names she's had interactions with. So we're getting hints of that and seeing her in those cases, but we're not really seeing her day-to-day experience. We're not really getting to know her as a fully rounded person, like I said. That balance that I was talking about between getting to know her as a figure and getting through the events of the Wars of the Roses, it's tilted slightly more in favor of getting through the events and a little less on the getting to know Cecily. It's still there. It's not like it's not there at all, but it's definitely more focused on getting through the events. And like I said towards the beginning of this clip, I think that the Wars of the Roses, if you're going to explore a figure and still explore the events themselves, you have to have a lot of pages to do it, to balance it all, because there's so much going on. It's really hard to have the time to focus in on a single character and who they are as a person, because you need to spend a lot of page time on the events themselves. So I feel like this is suffering a little little bit from that. Again, not enough that I'm disliking it. It's definitely, if I were to give it a rating right at this moment, I'd probably say 4 stars. It's really good. It's enjoyable. I'm not hating picking it up. I do like getting to know Cecily Neville, and I like how her relationship with her husband is being portrayed, because I think in other versions of this story I have read, which hasn't been a lot, granted, but the few that I have read, Richard Duke of York is really made out to be conniving the whole time, like he's constantly seeking for the throne. That's his motivation the entire time. Whereas in this, it's showing a lot more growth within him and showing how he does have this background of having this taint and suffering for it. And so it would make sense that during this 20 years or so before the Wars of the Roses really starts, where he's serving Henry VI, that he's not the whole time plotting to take the throne. It probably hit that point at some point throughout those 20 years, but it was probably a more gradual development, especially given his past. And so I like that it's showing a little more humanity in him than some of the other versions I've read. And I like that Cecily is being shown to be a very strong woman who also is willing to work within her role, but is still more outspoken than most women would be, and also more politically savvy than most women would be. I really like finding that balance between them acting as you would expect them to, fulfilling their duty at the time and taking that seriously, because whether you like it or not, women of the time, even though it's really sad that they didn't have options, women of the time, especially in the upper classes, knew their duty and their responsibilities, and they took them seriously. And I like how that's being shown through this, but also again that it's showing her political savvy, her intelligence, her awareness of things going on, her ambition. So like I said, I'm getting a lot about her, but I feel like she's not fully rounded because I'm really only getting that side of her. I'm really only getting the ambition and the political savvy. I'm not being able to see her much as a mother. We're not seeing her as much in her daily life, like how she interacts with her servants, how she interacts with other family members and people just in a casual way, like not focused around the politics. So yes, I just think it's too short for what I would personally want out of it. I mean, my favorite Wars of the Roses book is The Sunne and Splendor, and that is 900 pages. I really enjoyed A Rose for the Crown. I actually probably will like this a little bit better than A Rose for the Crown, simply because I had bigger issues with A Rose for the Crown. I also really have liked Wars of the Roses, the series by Conn Iggulden, and because it's a series, that's a lot more pages in that as well. So yeah, I'm getting a little rambly at this point. Basically, I am enjoying it. That's the biggest thing. It's a 4-star read right now. Like, I'm really liking it. I'm glad I'm reading it. It's just not really gripping me enough to be higher than a 4 stars. So brief thoughts, really brief, on How to Be a Victorian. Still liking it. Don't really have much to add to it. I mean, same feelings. I feel like with a nonfiction, especially like this, where it's just discussing the various day-to-day tasks of people during this time period, like, it's all going to feel about the same. There might be some portions that I'm more interested than in others. There was a portion where they talked about feeding babies and everything that was going into that, and just so sad, honestly. There were a few things that made me really uncomfortable. Obviously, there were discussions of them giving their babies drugs to keep them quiet and everything that went into that. There was a lot of discussion of just their complete misunderstanding of nutrition and things with nutritional value and how that really caused the babies to suffer. So honestly, it was one of those moments where you're like, wow, it's amazing that we've survived this long when these sorts of things were happening during that time, even just a couple hundred years ago. So that was really interesting. I just read a portion about doing laundry, and I just didn't really realize how intensive doing laundry was back then. Like, you think you hate doing laundry now, like, I just could not even imagine doing it back then with everything they had to do. So anyway, still enjoying it, still finding it fascinating. There's definitely some portions that are more interesting to me than others, but all of it has been educational, and I'm excited to come back to it in the future as I read more classics and I'm able to see more scenes where a lot of this stuff applies. So yes, anyway, there is that. There's Cecily. I'm thinking there will probably, I think in my last clip I said that there would be 2 after that one, but I think there will actually be 2 after this one because I realized I need to do my ending thoughts on How to Be a Victorian as well. So my next clip will be me finishing Cecily, and then the clip after that will be me finishing How to Be a Victorian. All right, so I have finished Cecily by Annie Garthwaite, and I really really enjoyed this. I know in my last clip I mentioned that I wasn't sure it would get that balance between exploring the character fully and also getting through the events of the Wars of the Roses. And in a lot of ways I still felt like that by the end, but there was enough going on in the end that I loved that it mattered less to me. And I felt like I got to know Cecily well enough that it worked out. One of my favorite things in this was actually getting to know Richard, Duke of York, her husband, because going into this, I had an idea of how Cecily would be portrayed, because I don't want to say it's cliche, but it's kind of cliche as far as her being a strong, independent woman in a difficult society. However, I will say something I did really appreciate was that she was a woman who was working with her times. Like, she wasn't trying to break the system or anything, at least not in that way. Like, she embraced her responsibilities while also being herself and not allowing herself to be ignored or forgotten, and inserting herself in conversations that otherwise she may not have been invited into. And so I really liked that. But yeah, I liked that, like, when it came to being a mother and having children, she didn't look at it like it was a burden. And I feel like in a lot of novels set in the medieval times and those historical eras, there's a lot of portrayal of women being burdened by having children. And it was just refreshing to have someone who is a strong woman, who has a lot of impact and influence on the people around her, who also is proud to be a woman having children. But anyway, moving back to Richard, Duke of York, I really liked his portrayal in this. Most of the time, he's portrayed as someone who's very manipulative and cunning, and this whole time that Margaret Beaufort's there, he's constantly trying to manipulate the system, and he always sort of wanted the crown, even though there were many, like a couple of decades in which he was around and doing stuff and wasn't gunning for the throne. So I really appreciated this look at him as a man who didn't necessarily want to become a traitor to his king, who didn't want the throne. He just wanted to get rid of people who were taking advantage of an ill king. In fact, in this, Cecily is portrayed as the one who really is a little more cunning and manipulative and wants that for her husband. Not cunning and manipulative with her family or her loved ones or anything, just politically and socially. She's very manipulative and cunning according to what she wants, and she is more ambitious for her husband than he is. It's so interesting also to read a historical fiction about a figure whose story you know pretty well, because little things mean a lot more. And like, I cried at a couple of things in this that if you didn't know the story, you would be reading and be like, oh, I don't like. One of them you might pick up on something because of the way it was written. Actually, both of them you would probably pick up on some emotion, but it makes it even more emotional when you know what's gonna happen. I think one of the best moments, I'll keep it as vague as possible. I mean, it's history, so like, I never know how much is spoilery when talking about historical fiction, but I'll give this as vague as possible. Basically, when Richard, Duke of York is going off with Edmund, his son, to continue fighting, Richard ends up talking with Dickens / Richard III, who's 6 years old at the time, and gives him something, and Cecily goes to see what it is, and it's a ruby red ring. And if you've seen the classic portrait of Richard III, you'll know why that made me cry. So anyway, it's just always interesting to read stories that you're like, I know the story. And so like these little things that other people probably wouldn't have as much emotional impact reading just wreck me, especially when it's the Wars of the Roses. Like, forget about it. Anyway, so yes, I really liked this. I loved the way it was written. I ended up giving it 4.5 stars and 5 stars on Goodreads, I want to say. And I ended up actually changing Daughters of Sparta, which I have right here, actually. I changed my rating on this to 4.25 on Storygraph and 4 stars on Goodreads. I really liked a lot about this, but there were certain things that did bother me in the first half. They were fixed and readjusted in the second half in a way that I appreciated, but it wasn't like in a way that was saying that the first half was necessarily incorrect in what it was saying. I don't really know how to explain what I'm trying to say, but basically on further reflection, I'm like, you know what, this is probably closer to 4 stars. And honestly, this may be brought down to 4 stars. Like, I'm not sure if it's like me actually loving this book or me just loving the Wars of the Roses. That made me just so gushy last night when I was finishing, and just all the emotions going on, because it was a part of the Wars of the Roses that I know about, and I just have all the emotions for the Wars of the Roses. So I'm not sure if it's just my love of Wars of the Roses or if it's my love of this book. I will say though, of the books, so I've read Sunne and Splendor, obviously by Sharon K. Penman. I've read the first 2 books in the Wars of the Roses series by Conn Iggulden. I've read A Rose for the Crown by Anne Easter Smith, I believe is her name, and now I've read Cecily by Annie Garthwaite, and I think I would put this I might put it just under Sunne and Splendor of those books, I think, actually. The only one that might beat it out is maybe Wars of the Roses by Conn Iggulden, especially the second book I really liked, but this might still beat it because Conn Iggulden takes a little bit more of the Lancastrian side, and I'm just a Yorkist girl, so anyway, that kind of lowers it down, but that's totally personal opinion, which I guess all of it is, but it makes this one rise up just because I am on the York side. And so, but it was really interesting comparing these two because that one also is discussing a similar time frame within the Wars of the Roses, whereas Sunne and Splendor and A Rose for the Crown are both focused on Richard III, so it's more towards the end of what we think of as the Wars of the Roses. Anyway, all that to say, I really liked this, and I'm glad I read it, and thank you, Jennifer, for getting it for me. I don't have any updates on How to Be a Victorian. I will say I just read a portion that discussed education and its relationship with menstruation for women, and I was dying laughing. The best part was when it talked about how girls, especially on their periods, shouldn't read novels because it would overstimulate their sexual feelings, and that was just dangerous, and it would make them mature faster, which was a sign of bad morals. And I was dying reading that portion, but yeah, it's still going great, and my next clip will be me finishing it. For you, it's just a second away. For me, it will be a few days, but anyway, that will be the next clip, and let's just go into that now. Hey guys, so enjoy a little bit of a different background. There's usually people around, so I'm not usually able to film up here. I mean, I could, but it would be a little awkward and probably loud. So anyway, I have officially completed How to Be a Victorian by Ruth Goodman. It is the last day of March, so perfect timing. And I ended up giving it 5 stars. I don't feel like I really have much more to say about it because it was pretty much the same basic formula all the way through. And I just really enjoyed getting to know the Victorian era on a deeper level. Obviously, you're only able to get so much from literature because it's fictional. So obviously, like literature today, it's based in reality, but there is some level of non-reality to what is going on. They're more of a way to showcase ideas as opposed to the way people actually lived, although there is some level of learning about that as well. So this was just a great experience, being able to really understand how they lived their daily lives, the various challenges they each face due to lack of information, but also just accessibility. Oh my gosh, I was just sitting here for ages silently trying to figure out what word I was looking for, but lack of accessibility to needed things such as food, clothing, a good, healthy environment to live in, and so it was just very eye-opening in a lot of ways, very engaging to read, I will say. There were definitely some dry points, but they were few and far between enough that it didn't really terribly bother me, and even some of those dry bits, like I finished reading them, and even though in the process of reading I didn't love it, it's still, the information still stuck in my brain, and so I was able to bring it up later with other people and be like, oh yeah, that's actually really fascinating. So yes, it was brilliant, really loved it. I'm super excited to get to How to Be a Tutor. I probably won't do it yet. I do have the audiobook for it. I don't know if I've mentioned that, but I think I do want to separate these out a little bit, but I did really enjoy that. I did want to briefly, I left my copy downstairs, but I did also finish Romantic Outlaws by Charlotte Gordon, and I don't have any vlogs really for it, so I wanted to give a more in-depth look at my feelings towards it. I ended up giving that one 5 out of 5 stars as well. Honestly, I started off not feeling a lot of affection necessarily for really either of the women, but particularly Mary Shelley. And then Mary Wollstonecraft would bother me. Like, both of them had these flaws that made it difficult for me to like them at first. But by the end of the book, I just felt like I was so close to these two women. I mean, as close as you can be reading a whatever third-hand account from hundreds of years later, but I really felt like I came to understand these women, and I felt like Charlotte Gordon did an incredible job. Like, I mentioned the flaws that they had. Like, she did an incredible job of just explaining what happened and some of the feelings that were going on based on what they wrote in letters and other things, journals and such, but kind of allows you as the reader to decide how you feel about them. She does end the book by describing her feelings towards these women, obviously really having a lot of respect and honor for them, a lot of sorrow over the fact that their names have really been manipulated and their personalities have been adjusted to fit times throughout the centuries. But you can tell Charlotte Gordon really loves these two women, and I feel like she really brought that to the page. She really brought them to life. They weren't just one-dimensional figures anymore to me. They became more fully realized people, and I really enjoyed that experience. And now I just want to read everything by both of them. Like, I'm just fascinated by them. I think one of my favorite things that I learned specifically about Mary Wollstonecraft is that John Adams read some of her work and loved it. Even though he didn't really agree with everything she was saying, he loved the way she thought and the way she approached describing her philosophy. And I thought that was just fascinating, because if you didn't know, I love John Adams. I love Abigail Adams. So hearing that one of my favorite historical figures had a level of affection for Mary Wollstonecraft and her ideas, especially when she was so forward-thinking, it just makes me love John Adams even more, and it makes me a lot more interested in Mary Wollstonecraft. It was great, and I would love to read more works by both of them. I've never read anything by Mary Wollstonecraft. Obviously, I've read Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, but that is it. So I would love to read more by both of them. I'd like to read more poetry by Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, and John Keats. I think particularly John Keats, oddly enough. He wasn't really in the story very much, but there was something about him that intrigued me, and especially like Percy Shelley's reaction to him that intrigued me. So anyway, that's all I really have to say about both of those for now. Again, they were both great reads. Everything I read in this vlog really was great. Thank you again to Jackie, Jennifer, and Connor for these wonderful gifts. I'm so grateful. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know down below if you've read any of the books I've mentioned in this video, your thoughts on them. I hope you had a wonderful reading month in March. I hope you continue to have one in April, and I will close out there. So thank you again for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye!